If you are tracking whether American institutions can still protect themselves under real pressure, you need to look carefully at what unfolded overnight in Washington. What happened at the Supreme Court of the United States was not a routine security matter, and it was not just another vague threat in a tense political era. It was a live demonstration of how fragile and how reactive the system has become when the highest judicial authority in the country is forced to move in the dark. Here is the cold fact that should immediately unsettle you. Just before midnight, the Supreme Court did not look like a courthouse. It looked like a hardened federal target. At approximately 11:47 at night local time, something unusual began to register around Capitol Hill, the neighborhood where the Supreme Court of the United States sits. Residents and people still nearby started posting observations on social media in real time. Not speculation, not commentary. Direct descriptions of what they were seeing with their own eyes. An unusually high number of law enforcement vehicles surrounded the Supreme Court building. Emergency lights flashed continuously. The security perimeter appeared wider than what is typically in place even during high-profile cases. At least one witness reported seeing U.S. Marshals in tactical gear. Let me say that again so it lands properly. Tactical gear at the Supreme Court near midnight. Now pause here because this is where context matters. Social media is noisy. Individual posts can be wrong. Single eyewitnesses can misinterpret what they see. And no responsible analyst treats one post as confirmation of anything. But that is not what happened here. Multiple posts appeared within the same narrow time window. They came from different accounts. They described the same elements, the same lights, the same vehicles, the same expanded perimeter, the same presence of federal security forces. The timestamps lined up. That level of consistency matters. It suggests a real-world event, not a rumor cycle. And it immediately tells you this was not routine patrol activity. Here is where the system quietly enters the frame. At 12:23 in the morning, a reporter for the Washington Post who covers the Supreme Court posted that she had received confirmation from a law enforcement source of an active security situation at the court. No embellishment, no detail, just confirmation that something serious was unfolding. That timing alone is significant. Supreme Court news does not normally break after midnight. There are no scheduled hearings, no public sessions, no routine activity that would justify that kind of alert. Which tells you the urgency was not about optics, it was about response. 50 minutes later, at 1:14 in the morning, CNN issued a breaking news alert. The wording was precise and, in law enforcement language, intentional. U.S. Supreme Court building secured due to security concern. Secured does not mean ceremonial. It means access restricted. It means sweeps conducted. It means internal threat assessments underway. What CNN did not say is just as important as what it did say. There was no description of the threat, no identified suspect, no explanation of scale. That silence is part of the signal. Then at 2:07 in the morning, the situation escalated in public view. NBC News reported on social media, citing multiple law enforcement sources, that Supreme Court justices had been evacuated and that the building was under what was described as a temporary lockdown. This is where the gravity drops. Evacuation is not symbolic. It is disruptive by design. It is a last-line protective measure when the system believes the risk may be immediate. And a temporary lockdown carries a very specific meaning. It signals a response to a concrete concern in the present moment, not a generalized atmosphere of threat. Now step back and absorb what that implies. The Supreme Court's normal operations take place during the day. Oral arguments happen in the morning. The building does not host scheduled judicial activity late at night. There is no public calendar that places the justices there after hours. So a question immediately surfaces, and it is not a trivial one. Why were Supreme Court justices in the building at that hour? According to all available context, it was not for routine judicial business. This is the point where the narrative shifts from an isolated security event to an institutional puzzle. Because once you accept that the justices were present and that they were moved under protective protocols, you are no longer talking about a hypothetical risk. You are talking about a system reacting in real time to something it could not afford to ignore. And here's the detail most people miss. The response did not begin with public statements. It began with movement, vehicles, perimeters, tactical posture, then confirmation from major news organizations, then acknowledgement without explanation. That order matters. Tells you the institution acted first, spoke later, and revealed as little as possible. Which raises a final question that hangs over everything that follows. What kind of information forces the Supreme Court of the United States to seal itself, move its members, and activate emergency security measures in the middle of the night without ever telling the public exactly why? The moment the public first heard from the system itself came at 3:34 in the morning. That timing matters. Institutions speak late only when they have already acted. The United States Marshal Service, the agency responsible for protecting the Supreme Court of the United States, released a short and carefully constructed statement. Every word was doing work. There was no flourish, no reassurance beyond the minimum required. The U.S. Marshal Service responded to a security incident at the Supreme Court building. The situation was assessed and appropriate measures were taken. There is no ongoing threat to the justices or the public. Normal operations will resume. That is the entire message. And it tells you more by what it omits than by what it includes. Let me pause here because this is where institutional language becomes a tell. The statement confirms a security incident, not a drill, not a precaution, not an exercise. It confirms that the response rose to a level requiring appropriate measures, a phrase that in federal security practice covers everything from evacuations to tactical deployment. And it explicitly states there is no ongoing threat, which implies that earlier there was at least the possibility of one. What it does not say is equally important. There is no description of the incident itself. No confirmation of whether Supreme Court justices were evacuated. No mention of arrests, detentions, or suspects. Silence on those points is not accidental. It reflects an institutional choice to close ranks rather than clarify. This is where the viewer needs to recalibrate expectations. When federal security agencies keep details this tight, it is usually because the underlying information is either sensitive, unresolved, or both. A few hours later, at 6:47 in the morning, the Supreme Court spoke for itself. The Public Information Office of the Supreme Court released its own statement separate from the Marshal's Service. Again, the wording was restrained, almost antiseptic. The court is aware of last night's security response. All justices are safe. The building is secure. The court will proceed with its scheduled calendar today. This is not a press release meant to inform. It is a notice meant to stabilize. All justices are safe is not language used unless safety was at some point in question. The building is secure confirms that it was treated as unsecured earlier. And the promise to proceed with the scheduled calendar is an assertion of continuity, an attempt to signal that institutional authority has not been disrupted. Here is where the shift happens. We move from emergency response to narrative control. At 7:23 in the morning, the Washington Post published a more detailed account based on interviews with multiple law enforcement officials who spoke on the condition of anonymity. This is where the outlines of the event begin to sharpen. According to those sources, the U.S. Marshal Service received information assessed as a credible threat directed at the Supreme Court building and the justices themselves. That assessment triggered an immediate response. Justices who were present in the building were evacuated as a precautionary measure. The perimeter was secured. The building was swept. No actual threat was discovered inside. By approximately 2:30 in the morning, according to the Post's reporting, the sweep was completed, the threat assessment downgraded, and the security posture reduced to normal levels. That timeline matters. It tells us the threat was treated as specific and immediate, not abstract or generalized. Institutions do not evacuate Supreme Court justices in the middle of the night for background noise. And this is the point where the picture becomes more unsettling. At 9:14 in the morning, CNN, citing federal law enforcement sources, reported that the incident was triggered by a tip suggesting a possible attempt to breach the Supreme Court. The tip included details about timing and methods specific enough that authorities could not ignore it. Nothing happened. No breach occurred. No attack followed. But the decision to act was made before certainty, not after. This is where you need to understand the posture of modern federal security. It is designed to err on the side of disruption rather than risk. The cost of moving justices is considered lower than the cost of being wrong. Then at 11:47 in the morning, NBC News updated its reporting with a crucial new detail. According to NBC sources, the tip that triggered the response originated from a foreign intelligence service. The concern involved a potential attack on the Supreme Court. There was no evidence of a finalized plan and no indication that an attack was imminent or actively underway, but the intelligence was considered specific enough to require immediate protective action. That detail changes the frame. A foreign intelligence source means international collection. It means information sharing between allied services. It means U.S. authorities were not reacting to a lone domestic threat report, but to intelligence moving through formal channels. This is where the event stops being just about one night. It becomes about the globalized threat environment surrounding American institutions. At 1:34 in the afternoon, the New York Times added another layer. The paper reported that Supreme Court security protocols had been updated the previous year. Those updates included specific procedures for rapid evacuation of justices in the event of a credible threat. The protocols were developed in consultation with the U.S., Marshal Service, and other federal agencies. According to the Times, the response overnight followed those protocols precisely. That tells us two things. First, the system worked as designed. Second, the system was designed because scenarios like this are no longer theoretical. By 3:07 in the afternoon, CNN reported that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had opened an investigation into the source of the threat information. According to law enforcement sources, the intelligence that triggered the response was based on intercepted communications. Investigators are now working to determine whether those communications reflected actual operational planning or were merely aspirational or hypothetical discussions. That distinction is critical. One leads to prosecution. The other leads to monitoring. And hovering over all of this is the recent history that made such a response almost inevitable. Since the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization in 2022, threats against the court have increased. Security was further intensified after an individual was arrested near the home of Justice Brett Kavanaugh in 2022 and charged in connection with an attempted attack. The institution has been operating under elevated threat conditions ever since. Which brings us to the uncomfortable reality beneath the timeline. This was not panic. This was protocol. This was not improvisation. This was rehearsal meeting reality. And the fact that it happened at all raises a question the system itself cannot answer. If Supreme Court justices can be quietly evacuated in the middle of the night based on intelligence that never materializes into action, how often is the line between stability and disruption being tested without the public ever knowing? In the time Washington went to sleep, the timeline was already locked in motion. At approximately 1:47 p.m., a threat assessment crossed a threshold serious enough to trigger immediate action. Within minutes, security protocols moved from monitoring to execution. This was not a delayed response, not a debate carried into daylight. It unfolded in real time under artificial light inside one of the most symbolically protected buildings in the country. The reaction was decisive and layered. Security units mobilized overnight. Judges who were physically present inside the building were evacuated, quietly but firmly. Access points were sealed. The entire complex was swept section by section with no shortcuts taken and no assumptions made. Multiple agencies coordinated through the night, operating on the premise that uncertainty itself was a risk factor that could not be tolerated. By roughly 2:30 a.m., officials confirmed what everyone was waiting to hear. The building was secure and those evacuated were safe. Several characteristics stand out when viewed together. First, the timing. This was not a high-visibility daytime incident designed for optics. It happened at midnight when staffing is thinner and decisions are more exposed. Second, the level of response. The threshold for evacuation was met without hesitation, suggesting that the threat was treated as credible enough to outweigh the institutional instinct to minimize disruption. Third, the coordination. This was not the action of a single security unit reacting in isolation, but a synchronized response across agencies accustomed to operating under federal contingency frameworks. Yet even as the system functioned as designed, important questions remain unanswered. How many justices were inside the building at that hour, and why were they there so late? Where exactly were they relocated, and under what security posture? What specific indicators elevated this threat above others that may never reach public awareness? These gaps are not trivial. They underscore how much of institutional security operates beyond public visibility, even as the public depends on its effectiveness. From a security standpoint, the night offers a clear data point. The response system activated properly. Newly refined procedures, many of them developed in response to recent years of escalating threats against federal officials, appear to have been executed without breakdown. No injuries were reported. No breach occurred. By morning, the court resumed normal operations outwardly unchanged. But zooming out, the broader meaning is harder to ignore. This episode fits into a growing pattern in which federal institutions operate under an ambient level of threat that would have been unthinkable a generation ago. Protection is no longer reactive, it is anticipatory, sometimes preemptive. The absence of an attack does not mean the absence of danger. It means the system chose to act before danger could materialize. That distinction matters. Evacuation orders of this magnitude are not issued lightly. They carry institutional cost, symbolic weight, and operational risk. Choosing to proceed anyway signals a recalibration of how seriously threats are now taken, even when details remain classified. The quiet decisiveness of the response may be the most revealing element of the night. As of now, the facts are straightforward. The judges are safe, the building is secure, there were no casualties, no attack was carried out. An FBI investigation is ongoing and details may emerge later or they may not. What cannot be dismissed is the reality that such threats are evaluated as real enough to disrupt the highest judicial body in the country without warning. This was not chaos. It was controlled disruption. Not panic, but procedure. And that may be precisely what makes it unsettling. If this is what routine threat management now looks like at the apex of the federal system, then the question is no longer whether American institutions can respond under pressure, but how often they are being asked to do so and how close to the edge those pressures are pushing them. So the unresolved question lingers sharper than before. Are these institutions successfully containing an increasingly hostile environment, or are they merely adapting to a new normal where emergency protocols quietly replace stability as the baseline of American governance? Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. If this analysis helped, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for daily updates on major political developments. See you next time.